The ECB, Mr. Lane served as the 11th governor of the Central Bank of Ireland from 2015 to 2019. In recent years, his keen insights and economic expertise have contributed to guide the Governing Council of the ECB through a period marked by exceptional events, and now through the ongoing process of monetary policy stance normalization. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to have Philip Lane here with us, ready to share some of his expertise with us and his perspectives on inflation and inflation expectations and the challenges and opportunities for monetary policy. We are eager to learn from his experience and vision, and please join me to give him a warm welcome.
I'd like to thank SUERF for the invitation, and also it's a great pleasure to be back at the Bank of Italy, and I very much enjoyed this morning's sessions, and I apologize in advance. I won't be able to stay for the whole afternoon or for tomorrow. So what I want to do is come back to the intense phase of this inflation episode. And what I want to do is discuss the 21-22 inflation surges through the lens of macroeconomic models. So this morning we had a lot of use of microdata, but this is going to be from a macro perspective. And of course, the interaction between micro and macro is, of course, what we do every day. Let me emphasize it's important to maintain the plural. This is not a single inflation shock. And it's tempting sometimes to kind of collapse it into a single episode, whereas I think anyone who lived through those years, at least in the policy world, there was distinct phases. And when you have a sequence of inflation shocks in one direction, that's essentially what I want to capture with the plural in that title. Now, we had high inflation, and that in turn led to the monetary policy response. But maybe an important feature of that episode is that it was unexpected. It was unexpected by the central banking community. It was unexpected by external experts, the people who work for investment banks and asset managers who try to predict euro area inflation. And it was not expected by market traders. And that unexpected nature of the inflation did trigger many questions about the performance of macroeconomic forecasters. And that's one element of what I want to do today. And I think this is despite the fact many people who rely on hindsight explain why it's all totally obvious, and why it was not a surprise. Today I'm not going to talk about it, but one of those conjectures is if you just look at the monetary aggregate data, everything is explained. So in Helsinki, which may have been a SUERF event as well, actually, in June, at the Bank of Finland, I went through the monetary analysis and why, in fact, it was not sending those signals. Okay, so that's one basic question is, why do we have macroeconomic models if they don't remotely forecast this major episode? So I think you can turn that on its head and say, well, in fact, the macroeconomic models can help understand why exactly this inflation episode was not forecast either in terms of scale or speed, and also identifying what were the mechanisms and the channels that may have been missed or understated. In response to this episode, scenario analysis has been enhanced and new models have been developed to enrich our understanding of this episode. And again, in the hope, if we see similar configurations in the future, the reaction can be different. Let me say also is that in addition to kind of full-scale macro models, macro modeling is also used in terms of some of the other ways to think about inflation, for example, in how we think about underlying inflation. That's very much a model-specific concept. And also, very importantly, for policymaking, because in the end, the biggest question is, was the monetary policy response appropriate? And in order to interrogate the monetary policy response, you need to set up counterfactuals, and the models can help us to do that. So today, what I want to go through is some of the following conclusions. So the retrospective analysis, model-based analysis, suggests that the large forecast errors in 21-22 initially were driven by energy and commodity price shocks, compounded by the Russia-Ukraine war, and also pandemic-related bottlenecks. However, it's also true that on top of those essentially shocks to the basic assumptions, changes in the transmission of shocks through the pricing chain and changes in the behavior of firms and consumers likely played an important role in amplifying and propagating those shocks, converting relative price shocks into general inflation. So from one perspective, you can aggregate that to say supply shocks, primarily originating from external sources, were key drivers. But it's also true in exactly the same time, there were global and domestic surges in sectoral demand patterns. So in the goods sector in 2020 and 21, and in the services sector, mostly in 2022, when the euro area finally reopened after the pandemic, after the Omicron lockdown. So these elements, supply side, and let me again emphasize this, sectoral demand and aggregate demand were also important, because the overall level of domestic demand in the euro area was barely above pre-pandemic levels by the end of 22. So it's very hard to point to some kind of very big aggregate demand response as being the driver. Now, from a policymaking point of view, the assessment that there was a predominant role for supply shocks, in combination with initially in 2021, the signals from the inflation expectations were still to the downside. So not that even that they were anchored, but still to the downside, supported the initial looking through approach of monetary policy in 2021. And I think that debate never got settled, because of course in early 22, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. So whether the shocks of 2021 would have dissipated, we're not going to know. Let me emphasize also, in terms of the extraordinary cocktail of shocks in middle of 2022, at the same time as the Russia invasion of Ukraine was happening, we had the reopening of the European economy after Omicron. So if you think about the onset of the war, which is very visible in many data sets in terms of creating uncertainty, falling confidence, there was still a good recovery in the European services sector in spring, summer 22. That's not because there's euphoria about the war. It was that more than one thing was happening. At the same time, we did have the reopening of the services sector. So when we think about policymaking, I think, and again, what I'm saying here is basically the result of the modeling team doing some work, is that if we had known what was about to happen, so if we had perfect foresight, interest rates would have been raised earlier and more sharply. So that I think is clear. If we had known inflation was going to rise so quickly, there would have been a quicker response. However, the assessment is conditional on the real-time information available to policymakers, including how the staff integrated the assessment into the baseline projections. If you take those baseline projections, the monetary policy decisions we took were broadly in line with what the models would imply in terms of optimal policy. That's true when we were not raising rates. It's also true when we started to raise rates. So another way of saying this is the overall monetary policy response, and of course, in turn, the substantial progress in disinflation was very aligned with the macroeconomic models. I think that's quite important. Okay, so let me come to the first point, which is why were these forecast errors so significant? And I think those of you who follow the forecasting process will notice the extraordinary scale of, and these are 1 quarter ahead, projection errors, quite big, especially in 2022. So to have a 1 quarter ahead inflation error of 2.5, given we're supposed to have an inflation rate stable around 2, this is a pretty big forecast error. Of course, we know a lot of the errors were in energy and food prices, so the core errors were smaller, but they were still big. And let me maybe, alongside the inflation errors, if you look at the GDP errors, in the grand scheme they were smaller, but maybe throughout, and maybe this is worth coming back to some of what we heard this morning, in actual fact, the ECB was, throughout this whole period, too pessimistic about GDP. So there's a much stronger GDP performance than forecast. That's not entirely true in 2023, but in 21-22, it was there. So just to highlight the role of the energy forecast error, the left panel shows you the projection round by projection round miss in terms of the inflation path. So what I showed you just 1 quarter ahead, now is the full projection horizon. And you can see throughout, essentially there's a big temporary component. So, okay, inflation is high now, it's going to come down quite quickly. And that was the repeated analysis throughout. Now, in the end, that's what happened, but only after, a number of quarters with a big miss. And of course, the disinflation happened from a very high peak. So there is an issue about forecasting the short term, even if you get the general shape of the medium-term response directionally okay. So the assessment that inflation would come back to target over the projection horizon, that has been proven to be a good assumption. But the exact level where inflation was going to kind of peak was repeatedly missed. And the first point to make here is, if you look at the right panel, is you can see, and if you just go back to the end of 2021, so already in 21, energy prices had picked up. But I think in 2021, this is just recovery. It was not a necessarily massively surprising pickup. But from the late 21 onwards, there was essentially the grey lines are what we thought, and we were continually missing this really big surge, the tripling of the energy index from mid-21 to mid-22. So if you like, the most basic critique is that the ECB missed its ability to forecast energy prices. But that is a kind of a collective global issue. I invite anyone to go back and find someone who was a good predictor of energy prices in that time period. So one way to think about it is captured in this chart here. So this is tracking the forecast error and basically saying, okay, what is the error that comes from missing out on the ingredients? And a lot of it is the energy forecast versus missing out the implications of those ingredients for overall inflation. In other words, the transmission of the shock. And what you see here is, if you look at the first 4 quarters there, so basically there were forecast errors in 2021, but you can see that the orange box is essentially the energy miss, and most of it was the energy miss. So the inflation forecast errors in 2021 was, if you like, heavily concentrated on not forecasting energy very well. Now, that remains, I think, true enough for the start of 22, If you go to the biggest forecast errors, which is mid-22, that remains true. But let me also highlight the purple box at the top. This is now starting to get non-trivial. It's still a minority contribution, but it's not a zero contribution from the purple box. So essentially, we were misdiagnosing core inflation in that time period. And again, I'll come to it. Maybe there's an element of misdiagnosing possible changes in the transmission mechanism during this time period. So let me, make the same point in a slightly different way here, which is what I show here. If you go again to the end of 21. The dotted orange line is what we expect to happen to inflation subsequently. So we had inflation coming down throughout the course of 22, and in fact settling a little bit below the target. That was the view in late 21. The solid blue line is what happened, and you see, of course, what happened. Inflation rose and has come down over a long time period. And the dotted red line is what the models would have forecasted if you'd given the actual energy price data. So in other words, let's imagine, contrary to what I just said, we were good at forecasting energy prices. Not even that, let's imagine we had a crystal ball, that we actually then you see that essentially inflation would have got to about 8%. So no change in the model, no change in how the world worked, simply the energy prices, having a crystal ball for energy prices, we would have been predicting inflation getting to about 8% instead of the 10 that it got to. So you go a long way, not all the way, but a long way with just simply the energy price assumption. And also with the energy price assumption, you get this gradual disinflation. So it doesn't instantly disappear. It comes down from 8 to 2 basically over a couple of years. So once you have a big, the macro models say it takes a while to feed through the system. There'd be a second round effect on wages. The full macro equilibrium will mean you get a couple of years of inflation, but at a decelerating rate. So the shape of the forecast would have looked in line with actually what happened. But we did miss by a couple of percentage points the peak. And on the other side, that's just another way of saying the same thing here, is basically, it's not only about the energy component. The light grey box at the top is basically other things. And that's possibly to do with changes in transmission. So I think I'm going to make a point. Is that before we get to changes in how the world worked in a nonlinear way, the first point I think to make is any model has uncertainty about the estimates feeding the model. So let's say you have a perfect model, but you pick essentially the kind of midpoint of all the estimates of the different coefficients in the model. If you go back and look at, well, let's imagine I picked a slightly bigger estimate or slightly small, but within the range of uncertainty, of estimate uncertainty. In fact, the claim here, even though I think, well, let's see if it's here. No, for some reason, that graph didn't make it. So I do, in the revised version of the speech, I do have a graph which basically says that actually no, it's embedded here in the end. The blue line. So the blue is basically this, or the blue interval there, is in terms of the distribution around that dotted red line. Not quite, but nearly all of it could be explained as essentially within the range of the statistical distribution of the model estimates. So before anyone starts saying, of course, you have to have a lot of nonlinearities, there's probably a lot of observation equivalence between a lot of nonlinearities between maintaining the model, but just saying that essentially that the model, the parameter selection for the model was not where it should be. And in turn, if you update your beliefs about the parameter estimates, I mean, a re-estimation for the future may look different. But I think economically, I think there's a lot of, I have a lot of sympathy for allowing for various nonlinear responses. So one example is in a high inflation environment, firms may adjust their prices more frequently, especially when you have cost plus shocks. Because essentially, if you have cost plus shocks, you say, well, I'm not due to change my price until January next year. You can go bankrupt before you have to. You say, well, I have to change my price because my costs are running higher than my revenue. And there's also work out there which basically says it's more acceptable to the consumer to pass along cost shocks. And I think there's lots of examples. You can look at photographs saying the coffee shop being very apologetic, saying, I'd love to keep my prices stable, but I can cite this cost push shock for the inflation. So that's one example. I think going back to a lot of the work we heard this morning, in an environment where many prices are going up at the same time, it's very natural if households increase their inflation expectation. And what Michael showed about perceived inflation and then 1 year ahead, I think that's absolutely in the data. So if you have an increase in expected inflation, even if medium-term inflation expectations are perfectly anchored, and they weren't perfectly, I gave you the coefficient of 0.3 this morning. So even if, but let's go for the extreme of perfect anchoring, even if the medium term is perfectly anchored, you can get a burst of inflation if in that kind of environment. So I think the issue, of course, then is ex ante, what is the trigger point at which you say, well, actually, we're now in a nonlinear environment. In fact, under these conditions, we should override the basic model and increase the inflation projection. This is possible. The inflation projection in the end is a judgment of the staff. It is not just a model output. And there's ECB work basically saying directionally the judgment of the staff moves in the direction of nonlinearities. But of course, the right nonlinearity in any given quarter will probably be different. But having a judgment-based approach to forecasting allows for these satellite type effects to come into it. And you can see here, this is just some data into various pricing micro data sets. And we have a lot of kind of overnight scanning data now, where essentially it's clear that the frequency of price adjustment did go up during this time period. So from a macro point of view, one of the kind of modeling issues is, how do I think about that in terms of running a macro model? And on the left side here, it basically says, well, if you try to estimate a Phillips curve, what you get is an increase in the slope. So there's some mix of an increase in the slope of the Phillips curve in this time period. So this is like a rolling regression on the left. And you see in this time period, we move from a flat Phillips curve to a steeper Phillips curve. But of course, I think it's difficult to tell apart increases in the slope versus intercept shifts. So there's essentially some jump in cost for any given level of slack. But I think on the right, the slack story is making some contribution. So what you see here is the blue dots on the left for the services sector are slack measures. I mean, there's other slack measures, but this is just capacity utilization. And if you think about the pandemic, in 2020, there's a big increase in slack. Many sectors are running way below capacity. And in 2020, we did have disinflationary pressure. But then when capacity utilization increased in 21 and 22, not to very high levels, but going back to more or less normal, So the vertical line here is kind of a long-term average. So when you jump back from being below, having spare capacity to having normal levels, in this time period when other factors are also putting pressure on inflation, maybe that partial tightening of slack helped to explain the jump in prices. So in the text, I give a more involved answer in the speech, but essentially you had a situation where at the same time you had energy cost increases. Firms in the services sector also saw a temporary increase in demand coming from the reopening of the economy. And again, that plausibly increased inflation pressure. Okay, so you might say that's a kind of one way to think about it, but why don't you give me a more structural analysis where you try to dig into the underlying shocks driving the economy? And so what I show here is a kind of shock decomposition coming from the ECB staff. And of course, for narrative purposes, I think it's important to think about this kind of decomposition, even if it's never going to be conclusive. But again, when you look at it, it's clear, I think, in 2021 that essentially supply shocks were most of the action. In 2022, supply shocks continue to have most of the action. Again, not just global supply, but domestic supply, because there were bottlenecks, for example, in the services sector in 22. But now you start to have visibility in terms of global demand, the light blue, and domestic demand. But let me emphasize, in terms of that 8 percentage point maximum deviation from the long run average, 0.8 percentage points is coming from global demand. So 10% of the excess inflation is coming from domestic demand. So not zero. 0.8 is a big inflation shock compared to 2%, but compared to the overall 10% shock, the normal of 2 more or less plus 8, domestic demand was there, but it was not the dominant issue. There's a bigger role or a significant role for global demand. And of course, we know through commodity prices and so on, that global demand would have played a role. Let me emphasize also, when we look at the drivers of commodity prices, I've sometimes seen it said, well, global commodity prices are sensitive to ECB monetary policy. That is not what the ECB finds. It's not zero, so it's not nothing, but it's not so big that it's worth talking about. So what you see here is essentially a diagnosis that there's this cocktail of shocks in 2022, global supply, but also at the same time, more of a contribution from demand. This was reflected in our monetary policy statements, where we did have references consistently to sectoral demand mismatches playing a role. Now, of course, I think one of the debates which is going to be ongoing, which is the vaccines were invented at the end of 2020. At that point, you should have been confident the pandemic was going to come to an end at some point. And already by the end of 2020, allowing for lags in monetary policy transmission, you should have been tightening monetary policy in order to avoid that when the pandemic reopening happened in 2022, you would have this surge in inflation. I think, and Ignacio may have his own recollection, it was not obvious throughout the course of 2021 that the vaccines were going to work. New variants. It's not obvious how quickly they would be rolled out. And there were still many questions about downside risk to the European economy. So, but my point here is, if you believe there are lags in monetary policy, unless we had tightened policy, in early 21, it's hard to see those demand shocks in 22 being suppressed. Let me also say that it should, and I think in this audience it's clear, it's also important to think about how monetary policy affects inflation expectations. And I think that it's important to look at the 1 year ahead and so on. But what I'm going to show you here is about the risks of long-term inflation expectations getting de-anchored. Because, of course, that's the worst-case scenario. It's also important, and this is why we repeatedly said we want a timely return of inflation to the target, that we want to make clear to people we were not just going to let this run, the impulse response function to run without trying to speed it up through monetary policy. But as I say, the worst case scenario is if long-term de-anchoring had occurred. And so the way the staff dealt with this was that they basically had a kind of a two-regime model where there's a risk that instead of being in the regime where inflation is anchored at 2%, that the experience of inflation would lead to an updating of beliefs and you move to a de-anchored regime. And this is what that kind of two-regime model gives you. And again, let me emphasize, throughout 2021, now the people doing this take the projections as a given. And throughout 2021 and the first part of 22, as I showed earlier on, the inflation projection was still actually projecting in the baseline not only return to target, but actually that inflation would fall below target, which is where it was before the pandemic. So in that period, the risk assessment was, it's still the case, downside de-anchoring was more likely than upside de-anchoring. Again, on the presumption that the inflation spike would not last very long and would come down quite quickly. But then from March 22 and especially June 22 onwards, that downside de-anchoring risk went very close to zero, and we started to have noticeable upside de-anchoring risk. So the communication from mid-22 onwards, where essentially we said that the role of monetary policy is not only to dampen demand and so on, but also to anchor inflation expectations, was motivated by this kind of analysis, saying, look, reasonable ways to model the anchoring risk suggest that now the light is flashing and you need to take care about the anchoring risk. Okay, maybe I'll make one last point in terms of this initial diagnosis. So then the question is, if you say, okay, monetary policy needs to act, then the question is how to calibrate that, how big of a reaction is needed. And of course, we were coming from a very unusual period of an extended period at the lower bound, lots of QE, lots of TLTROs and so on. So just quickly in terms of another part of what we did was say, look, we're not so sure how powerful monetary policy is going to be. The strength of monetary policy transmission has been a kind of indicator we've looked at throughout, saying, look, under these circumstances, what can we see? And essentially the assessment in terms of the strength of monetary policy transmission is that first of all, in terms of the data set, the left panel shows the rate hiking was steeper than the normal situation. It was coming from a situation before we started of the policy rate being flat, when in fact usually you start hiking after a period of easing in terms of the policy rate. And we went up more quickly. So in terms of saying, okay, do we know how this works? It was at variance to the historical pattern. So this raised questions about whether monetary policy would be more powerful or less powerful than normal. So number one, in the second panel, we show that essentially the lending rates to firms went up quite quickly. So this was saying, okay, it's not just in the market, it's going to be true in terms of what the firms are seeing and what the households are seeing. And what you see here is there's a very rapid change in credit. So credit volumes normally in a tightening cycle keep on growing in nominal terms, and only with quite a lag do they turn around. Actually, in this occasion, it moved quite quickly, that we moved from credit growing to credit being very stagnant. And that's true for credit to firms and also true for credit to households. So in terms of deciding how much monetary tightening we needed to do, allowing for the fact that the transmission was uncertain was important. Okay, I want to come to the policy counterfactuals. Maybe just very quickly say that it would be kind of an error to say, well, if you're making forecasting errors, you need to drop the modeling and just focus on judgment or something. In fact, what we did was, okay, let's also use the macro models to think about alternative ways to think about inflation. And I think this work by the staff has been important about underlying inflation. And so there's different types of measures. There's exclusion-based measures where you basically kick out volatile elements of the inflation index. So that could be food and energy, so core inflation, but there are other things like trimmed means of different types and so on, or super core inflation, or other measures. The alternative is to have a model where you try to extract the persistent component of inflation. So the PCCI is the persistent common component of inflation. Supercore is like that as well. And so, but we were confronted with the situation. If you looked at these measures in a standard way, it looked like underlying inflation. Again, underlying inflation is the inflation you expect, let's say, a year from now or 2 years from now. It looked like that of the 10% in peak inflation, 8% would remain in the data. So this was basically, I think, in conflict with what you think about the economics of what was going on. So if you believed that the energy price surge was not going to repeat itself, and if it's actually going to either fade out or actually go into reverse, then having measures which kind of dummied out the impact of energy prices on these underlying inflation measures was important. So the adjusted measures basically come from a structural VAR, where essentially you kind of hold constant energy prices and put the bottleneck indicator. So number one, it gave you a much lower peak inflation rate. So instead of saying that underlying inflation was going to go to 8%, it's more like 5%. So and when you think about the calibration of monetary policy, we weren't trying to kill 8% underlying inflation. We were trying to kill a number more like 4 or 5. Because in fact, on the model-based measure like PCCI, it's more like 4. So what we did, if you like, was kind of in response to thinking a year from now, inflation, might be still above target, but not remaining at the super high level. And in fact, the December 22 projection for inflation 1 year ahead was 3.3. In fact, by December 23, it's below 3%. So we went from 10% at the end of 22 to below 3 at the end of 23. So most of the disinflation happened quite quickly. Another way of saying that is underlying inflation did not go up as much as might have been expected. Let me make a second point, is that in 23 and indeed this year, the standard measures fell quite quickly, but these adjusted measures did fall, but much more slowly. Another way of saying that is some people got kind of head faked by the reversal in energy prices, meaning underlying inflation measures fell. But if on the way up you say, well, hold on, let's kind of extract energy prices as a kind of fake signal, when energy prices fell, you also extract them. And so you had a much smoother adjustment. And the still questions remained about services inflation. So, okay, so let me come to the policy counterfactuals. So then the question is, is what we did reasonable? And a lot goes to the question of whether you say with hindsight or in real time. So, and here we use two of the models at the ECB. So the new area-wide model is a well-known model, and then there's this, sounds like a vaccine, MMR. So this is Mazzella's motto, and Risteniemi have worked on this model, which is well suited for policy simulations. And the blue line is the policy path we actually did. If we had hindsight, so we actually knew the inflation forecast and GDP numbers that were actually coming, this says we would have hiked in 2021, and we'd have brought interest rates to around 6% in the MMR model. I'm going to focus on MMR, which I think, if I had to pick, is, I think, because it's better at endogenizing policy. That would have been the rate path. So this is basically saying, if we had known inflation was going to be so high, we would have hiked earlier. In the middle panel, if you can read it, what it says is, under that alternative, in fact, inflation would have peaked at around 8, not 10. So we would have had about 2 percentage points less inflation. So a crystal ball central bank would still have had inflation going to 8%, not 10. But what you also see on the right side, we would have had a very difficult 2022 in terms of the performance of the economy. Because what you see here is in 2022, the Q-on-Q growth rates were around -1. So, at an annualized basis, that's -4. So it would have been, instead of having a good recovery in the economy in 22, we would have been in a much more difficult situation. But let me say that difficult situation would have been optimal from the point of view of the model. This is what the loss function says. In balancing, inflation was so high, you would have tolerated a kind of worse economic performance in order to get inflation down more quickly. So I think that's important. But then when you look at all the other lines here are the optimal policy from the point of view of the different projection rounds, December 21. So in December 21, the forecast was saying, yes, it remains true that you keep interest rates at 0 or below. So the orange line on the left, you see still around 0 throughout. Based on what we had in December 21, we were not planning to raise rates. Then in June 22, the green line, I said, okay, given what you have, you need to start hiking rates, but maybe to the mid ones at the peak. But when you get later on, we actually converge to what we actually did. So this is what I said in the introduction, is what we did was fairly close to what the models said we should do based on the baseline projections. Now, I think the next graph just kind of says the same thing, but just to emphasize these differences in inflation, depending on the. So this is the early tightening. So in real time, we would have tightened, but if we had tightened earlier, inflation would have dropped, but only a little bit. So any debate about you should have gone in March 22 or December 21 compared to going in June 22, that was going to deliver a minor difference. So, the kind of small variation around what we did, small variations in interest rates don't make that much difference. It's the overall path. What would have made a difference, to repeat, is going early and going large. So again, in terms of the debate about monetary policy, it's not about being a little bit late. It's about having a very different overall vision of how monetary policy should work. And then just finally, in terms of the kind of model analysis, what this graph shows you is across different models, the impact of the tightening, where again, we think even without the de-anchoring analysis, inflation would have been substantially higher without this tightening. So let me say, and I go into more detail in the speech, of course, we don't just take the model-based optimal policy. We think about the risk assessment around that policy. And this is obviously going to be ongoing discussion, but let me make 2 points. One is in March 22, which is more or less when the Fed started to tighten. Why didn't the ECB tighten at the same time? one basic type of uncertainty then was the Russia-Ukraine war. And again, let's go back in real time, what the European economy felt like at that time, what the uncertainties were. And the ECB did publish a scenario analysis around the March 22 baseline for that reason. And if you looked at the downside scenario, the case for not tightening policy was fairly strongly motivated. And then in September 23, when we did our final hike, the model-based analysis probably could have remained at 375. But in the text, I go into the risk management reasons, saying, well, maybe at the margin, it'd be safer to go to 4%. Okay, so let me stop. I mean, I've covered a lot here. And again, I hope you have time to not only read the text, but as usual, the footnotes have a lot. There's a lot in the footnotes in this speech. And this, of course, is not going to be the last word about looking back and thinking about this time period. But the basic points here are, was it a failure of macro models, or was it basically really big surprises in terms of the energy market? I think the macro modeling community does have to debate about all of these non-linearities, which I think kicked in. But what I would emphasize is we still don't know in real time at what trigger do these non-linear channels kick in. So if you tell me there's going to be another pandemic and war at the same time, I'm going to say I'm pretty sure I'm going to focus on the non-linear mechanisms. But short of that configuration, where exactly you say, well, these state dependencies kick in, maybe some of you already have estimated the relevant models to say, here's the threshold at which things go non-linear. But I think it's going to be an ongoing question. Okay, so let me stop there, because the time says 0, so I'll stop.
So thank you very much for the speech. I have lots of questions, but I already see that we have questions also from the audience. So I will start from the audience.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this brilliant presentation, and also for your very frank and, in a way, self-critical words. I mean, this is really phenomenal for a policy institution. I have 2 questions, which are sort of related. You pointed out, I think quite convincingly, that energy price assumptions bore the bulk of the ECB's projection errors on inflation. Now, 2 questions. First, how can economists get a better grip at modeling and forecasting energy prices? Should that be a research priority for economists at large, for the whole profession, both academia, financial sector, policy institutions? To this end, do we need to integrate geopolitical and geoeconomic considerations into our modeling or into our external assumptions, scenario building, or whatever? And the second question is, when energy prices fell back, which you showed very well in your charts, inflation just padded out but stayed at positive levels, so it didn't turn negative. So, of course, arithmetically, this means that cumulated price level effects of the inflation bout remain pretty big, with its impact on redistribution, inflation tax, long-term inflation expectations, credibility, trust in state institutions. Now, I would be interested in your thoughts on how to appropriately take into account price level effects in central banks' reaction functions. Thank you.
Okay, so let me, because we think a lot about these questions. So we take the market curve for energy prices. I'll come back to the market curve, but let me say a lot of impressive work had to happen quickly because the conversion of wholesale prices to retail prices, you have to know a lot about the institutional detail of for example, the electricity pricing across Europe. where, you know, it's not the average cost of the inputs, it's the marginal use of energy. Then in some countries, we have wholesale to retail very quick. In other countries, the energy utility providers have long-term contracts or they smooth. And this is why the Euro system is so important. Because in the end, when we do a lot of the forecasting, the mapping is country by country, because in Spain is very different to in Germany. You know, so I think on top of macro models, you do have to know a lot of institutional detail. And I think that was done quite well. Geopolitics, let me come back to the question is, what do we know that the market doesn't know? Let me advertise a recent bulletin article by the ECB with geopolitical shocks, where they basically showed initially energy prices tend to spike if there's, you know, geopolitical shock, but actually very quickly they fall not back to where they were, but below that, on the conclusion that geopolitical uncertainty creates downside macro risk, because uncertainty effect dominates any kind of interruption in the ability of oil and gas firms to do their work. So what I would say is we have to be agile in relation to shocks, but and you know, not just reading or looking at the market curve. You know, we would read, and it's amazing, you know, there's such a big incentive to forecast energy prices. There's lots of really good analysts out there working for investment banks or for private firms, where they really go into, well, you know, I know something about Libya happening next week. Everything, you know, everything is looked at. But in the end, the market curve, I think, is pretty efficient at aggregating what's knowable. So for us to say our guys who are not compensated at the same rate as the people working in the market are going to have some exquisite. What is true is some central banks take, well, random walk. That doesn't particularly work. So nothing, we look all the time, nothing dominates the market curve. The price level issue, of course, is super important. And I think the ECB's staff have done quite well, and the Eurosystem staff. Going back to once we were at peak inflation, the trajectory from there to where we are now has been really good. Really small forecast errors. Really, and again, a lot of this is price level catch up. The reason why wages have been around 5 point something this year and similar last year was not because the labour market's been super tight. It's been because of the fact that real wage catch-up is going on. So the lagged price level is playing a lot of work in the model. And actually, it's been really impressive how well that has worked. And again, looking to next year, we think that price level catch-up is nearly over. And therefore, this is one reason why the wage settlements in Germany are now quite low. Let me say again, because I know it's been part of the US debate, again, this is me being an amateur sociologist, not a professional point. It is when inflation spiked in Europe, governments put a lot of money, many subsidies to try and insulate the poorest households from inflation. There was about 3% of GDP in transfers in late 22. The US did not do anything. They did something earlier on with, you know, transfers, but not in response to high inflation. And then I think with unions intermediating between employers and workers, there's a shared narrative. And the union narrative has been the way to deal with the high inflation is to make sure wages catch up. So I think this is probably for those of you who are studying expectations, it's an interesting, and I buy the idea that people think prices are supply shocks and wage increases are your individual genius, explaining why you get the wage increase. Maybe in Europe a little bit weaker because of the fact it's so explicit in all the communication that the reason why we are able to achieve an extraordinary wage increase this year is because of the catch-up. The reason why we are settling next year for much lower is because we've delivered that catch-up. So, I mean, that's speculation, but I think the explanation that you don't try and drive the price level back to where it was, because with downward wage rigidity, that'd be very painful. But you make sure wages catch up, you know, not in an index type of way, but in a kind of sensible way, I think has been important.
We're already out of time, but just 1 minute for one more question.
No, thank you, Philip. Just one question. My prior before your speech was that basically the assumptions are those which implied the forecast errors. The behavior more or less changed, but not that much. On the other hand, you have this Phillips curve slope that really changes somewhat. What is missing in that reduced form of inflation with respect to demand and import prices and so on is the speed of adjustment with respect to actual prices. And that is also a change that happened. So Lippi and the others think that this is really what explains the major increase in inflation. The question is, have you tried to do some an attempt at trying to evaluate how important that was?
Yeah, so again, in the text, I try to be a bit more careful about it. So what I think is important to say is, I think the dominant issue were those cost shocks causing firms to raise prices more quickly to avoid bankruptcy, essentially. They really had to. But I think on top of that, in that environment, the kind of moving from a very slack economy in 2020, and especially in 22, when we all saw it, that this limited supply capacity in hotels, restaurants, airlines, in collision with a recovery of demand from low levels, not to extraordinary levels, but definite delta in demand, did lead to sharper price increases than normal. That's going to give you that kind of change of slope of the Phillips curve, but it's not coming out of nowhere. It's in the context of the cost shocks and so on. So I would say, if I wrote I think we'll see more from the ECB staff, but understanding what that meant. It's not to say that essentially the change in slack was the driver of inflation. That's not the message. But it was saying, given that there was some change in slack, it was going to lead to a bigger price response than normal. But in the end, when you do the shock decomposition, as I say, the domestic demand component was like 0.8, which is not nothing. But out of 8 percentage points, 0.8 is not the dominant issue. But it's not nothing either, so I don't want to... well, I think the big issue there is, to kill that, we'd have had to hike, not in early 22, but, much earlier, and, that can be discussed, so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the next session. It's a bit of a peculiar organization. We have one paper of the session, then we have the coffee break, then we have two more papers. The first one is by Giorgio Benigno, professor at Lausanne. I kept track of your late movements, former New York Fed, and he's going to tell us about how really global the inflation shock was. You have 30 to 35 minutes, and then we have questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to this super interesting conference. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Rome. Two notes. The first one that I didn't put there, of course, a couple of my co-authors are at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bce and Ante, and of course the paper, or what I'm going to say, does not reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the system. And the other one is that this is a very preliminary work, despite the fact that I've been on this topic for 2 years. So it's actually much inflation persistence. So that's the idea. So what is the key question that we want to address in the paper? Something that it's quite complement, I would say, to what Philip has been talking about in the past hour or so. What are the roles of, what is the role of global shock? What is global shocks in explaining the recent surge on inflation? Don't have to motivate that too much because, of course, everyone here is aware about the post-pandemic inflation spike. But one thing that we want to stress and we want to emphasize in this work is the importance of looking at different dimensions of the inflation surge by looking at different components of inflation or different aggregates. And of course, there are many that people use depending on data availability and the importance for each country perspective. Here, what we're going to do is that we're going to focus on headline, core, and headline, core, and I forgot the other one, which is not one that is listed there. But the idea here is to try to see how the shocks that we identify propagate through these different measure of inflation. So what is the background of this is the work that we did and we started when I was in New York at the Federal Reserve. We, of course, faced this inflation shock and we tried to understand what was going on. We had developed back then this index of global supply chain pressure. That is the index that we are going to use here in this work. And there are a couple of blogs in which we are discussing its importance for understanding the driver of inflation, emphasizing this supply side dimension that is also common to what Philip has just discussed. So let me show you a bit this measure of inflation. What is interesting here, we just selected country, we see a few events that are listed there. This is CPI inflation, is what we can see is the pattern that is common across countries, even though here we have two countries that had a relatively moderated inflation, which are Japan and Switzerland. But for the other, it's a very similar pattern. And then the next graph actually look at the producer price inflation, which is the one that I forgot earlier on, and which is actually more interesting, the most interesting one. And then core inflation, for which we see also a similar pattern, even though things, of course, are a bit different in terms of the size of the response of producer price inflation that is particularly pronounced, and core, if you look at the index there, that is relatively more muted. The other aspect that I want to stress here, that in my opinion is interesting, is the following, is that when you look at all this, and you look at, for example, at headline inflation nowadays, you look at headline inflation, and for most countries that is relatively close to the target. But what is interesting is that if you look at the underlying or these different measures, you see that there is quite a difference relatively to the pre-pandemic experience. So if you look at pre-pandemic, there's much more compression. When you look at what is happening now, there is much more diversion in terms of these measures across country and also within a country as well. Now, what do we do here in this paper is that we try to address the question of the importance of global shocks. And we do that along the three dimensions that I mentioned before. We focus on consumer price inflation, we focus on producer price inflation, and we also focus on core inflation that exclude foods and energy. And how do we do that? Basically, we rely on in-house products of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to extract these shocks that we want to focus on. And we call these global shocks. So the first one is the global supply chain pressure index that we constructed. I'm gonna explain a little bit about that index in a minute. The second one is something that is not published, but we did at some point refer to in a blog, which is a global demand pressure index, which is a byproduct of the supply one. It's constructed by using the insight that we have developed by constructing the global supply chain pressure index. And the third one is an oil supply shock, which is published, or was published actually up to a year ago by the New York Fed in a weekly oil report. And now they don't do, but if you ask, they're still available for use. So let me briefly go over what do we do here. Basically, we start from these shocks that we have constructed, that are out there, and then we do a very simple exercise. This is a super simple or relatively simple empirical analysis, still preliminary, in which what we do is that we use a local projection method, and we apply it at different level of inflation. So we do that for producer price inflation, consumer price inflation, and core inflation. And we conduct the analysis in different ways. So the first one is that we apply it at the level of individual country. So we use a local projection, individual country, for all these three measures. Then we do it by extracting principal component from all these countries together. So we extract the principal on this principal component by using these shocks. And third, we do a panel. So we basically combine all the information together and we do a local projection of this panel of countries that we consider. And what I'm going to present here in terms of this analysis are the impulse responses and the historical decomposition. And let me give you a bit of an overview of the results. So there are some interesting things actually that happen. Some things are not too surprising, of course, and there are a lot of papers that have studied variation of all these analyses. So I'm not going to go into related literature. I'm happy to take suggestions on actually what we should look at more carefully. But one thing that we want to stress, of course, there is an important role of global factors in driving these different measures of inflation. This is particularly relevant, not surprisingly, as I said, when we look at producer price inflation. And in terms of ranking of importance of this global factor on these different measures of inflation, we have producer price inflation as the most relevant. And then we go, of course, core is the one on which the impact is more muted. What is interesting here is when we look at impulse response, and this goes back to what I think Philip was saying earlier, is that when we look at impulse response, and I'm going to show you later, is that we see a very strong persistence of the global supply chain pressure index shock. But what is interesting is that this persistence comes when we look at the whole sample. So the full sample that include the pandemic here. Okay. When we look at the truncated sample, pre-pandemic, we see less persistence. So what is the implication of it? How do we interpret it? Of course, the shock, as we will see in a minute, is very big during the pandemic. And one possible interpretation, following up on what Philip was saying earlier, is that we might have nonlinearities that we are not fully capturing here, or also differences in the way in which the shock transmit when there are this big shock that happens that we are also probably not capturing. Now, when we look at historical composition, we see something that mimics a bit what I just said in terms of impulse response, because our global factor actually track pretty well this component, this principal component that we extract from all the measures of inflation across country. But when we go in the post-pandemic period, we don't find a strong link between our measure shocks and the principal component that we extract. So again, there is something that we're missing, maybe in terms of the way we design our model, or something that we are not capturing that is, of course, specific to the pandemic. And I will show you a bit of individual country decomposition. And what is interesting there, when we look at individual country decomposition, we have many, we have 20, plus 20, that it's interesting, there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the accounting of the shock for the pandemic inflation. So I'm going to show you a couple of historical decomposition that I think are interesting. So let me go first and explain a little bit this global supply chain pressure index. It's something, as I said, that we actually developed on the run when we were in New York and tried to understand the initial surge of inflation in 2021. So we had a briefing actually with President Williams, and then we had to come up with a way to understand what was happening. And our insight was to construct an index that was capturing the tension that were emerging at the level of supply chain. There was a lot of talk back then in terms of the disruptions that were occurring, and people were using different indicators to capture these disruptions. And our idea was very simple, was just to say how we can, first our question was which one is the best indicator? And we didn't have a good answer. And then we come up with the idea of try to combine these different indicators that were capturing different features of these supply chain disruption and put them all together. So what we did is that we collect the indicators that people were using. In terms of global transportation, we had different measures that we used. We look at subcomponents of PMI, and we use those subcomponents of PMI that we believe were important for capturing those disruptions of delivery time, backlogs, and purchase stocks. And then we try to have a extensive coverage. And in terms of time series, what we chose were 7 countries that are relatively well integrated in this global supply chain world, and for which we had significant availability in terms of data. So US, Euro area, UK, Japan, and 4 East Asian countries, Taiwan, South Korea, China, actually Japan, I forgot. So what we did, and this is important in order to understand the other indicator that we construct, is that we took all these indicators, of course, we normalized them, and we isolate the supply component. So we wanted to make sure that we were capturing disruptions in terms of inability to produce because there were no worker or other logistic difficulties. And we basically regress what we constructed out of a proxy for demand from the PMI. And we use the new order data as a proxy for demand that, of course, also we standardize appropriately. And the residual from this regression is what we use in a principal component analysis to extract the global supply chain, okay? So in this sense, our global supply chain was meant to capture this supply side of problems that were arising at the level of this global network, okay? So this was our first contribution to focus on this global supply chain. So this is the one that I'm going to use. I'm going to show you how it changes over time. But what we're going to do here, and we're going to use, and also we developed there in New York, was another indicator. We received a lot of comments on this supply chain index. And one comment was that, or maybe you're not, I mean, it's important also to look at the demand side. So to do that, basically, we first constructed another proxy, which is what we call net global supply chain pressure index, because there we don't do these supply extraction, okay? We just use those indicators as they stand, we normalize them, and we do the principal component. So in the sense that captures the net pressure at the level at which we are looking at, which is this global supply chain dimension. And from there, we construct the global demand pressure index. How do we do that? Basically, we compute the difference between these two principal components, the global supply chain pressure index and this net demand, this net version of it, to extract this demand component. And what is important, what I want to stress is that this difference is a global demand component. It's not country specific again. It comes from considering all these countries together. So let me show you a bit, one example of this construction. And the blue line, so we need, of course, these are two series, the principal component that measures the deviation relative to the historical mean. So in order to extract the demand, we need to normalize them at a given point in time to make sure that they are comparable. And this is an example by normalization starting from the beginning of the pandemic. And what do we see there? The light blue is the GSCPI, the original series. And then we have the red one, which is the demand component. Sorry, the net component. And the gray bar are the difference between the two that are the global demand pressure. Okay. So the global demand pressure is the one that we're going to use in our analysis here. But what is interesting in this graph, you can see, is that in the period in which inflation picked up, it's basically all coming from the supply side. So according to the way we are measuring things, of course, there's always a criticism about that. But our analysis, or based on what we are measuring, we would say that things are more related to supply side rather than the demand. So demand was very negative, as you can see there at the beginning of the pandemic. This is consistent with the closure of the economy. Then it started being positive a bit, but it never became positive to sustain or to be on top of the disruption that we had on the supply side. The other aspect that is interesting, if you look at this, because this series are measuring deviation from historical mean, so standard deviation from historical mean, is that these are very huge deviation, okay? So we are talking about more than 4 standard deviation relative to the historical mean. So we are talking about big shock. And the last one is the oil price. Again, as I said, this is produced by the New York Fed, so I'm going to go fast. My former colleague, Jan Groen, had a paper in which discussed how to do that. I think you have a comparable one that we should use also to compare our results. But basically, in that paper, what they do is that they look at Brent oil price and they extract demand and supply effects based on identification of cross-correlation among different financial variables. Let me show you a bit these series. These are the series of the shock that we construct: the demand shock, the global supply chain pressure index shock, and the oil supply shocks. You can see so how those are changed over time. And of course, the interesting part is the post-pandemic, in which we see big fluctuations in these shocks. So again, going back to the nonlinearity, and we can see it here. This is zoom in coming from 2019 onward in terms of this shocks. Now, first thing that I want to show is the principal component once we consider all the measures of inflation. And this principal component is for the three measures of inflation: consumer price inflation, producer price inflation, and core inflation. This is the black line. The other ones are the standardized measures, relative measures of inflation for the 22 countries that we are there. So what is interesting to note here is that this principal component becomes very big during the pandemic period, exceed the standardized inflation for all measure of inflation. And why that is the case? That is the case because basically when you construct this principal component, the fact that, so this is weighted average of the measures of inflation that we consider, the weights become bigger, the more synchronized are these inflation. Okay. So the fact that we see those spikes during the pandemic, it means that inflation measures were highly synchronized. Okay, and that happened along these three dimensions: the consumer, the producer, and also core inflation. The other thing that you can do here, I didn't say, of course, the first principal component represent the common global inflation trend. The other thing that we did in this paper is that we basically regress our measure of inflation for different set of countries there on this global principal component. And what we see there is the R square of this regression. Again, there is something noticeable there. When we look at the CPI, PPI, and we see relatively big coefficient in terms of R square. The second principal component is relatively small, except for Japan. So it's also interesting. There is something happening particularly or specific to Japan. So we see that at the level of core, at the level of PPI, there's less explanatory power coming from the first principal component, and also at the level of consumer price inflation. And here, the other thing that we did is to try to see to the extent to which this is robust by considering the subsample. So we focus on the pre-pandemic and the old sample and also post-pandemic. And again, we see an outlier now in terms of Japan. This is a CPI. And also less explanatory power of the first principal component when we look at United Kingdom. So there is a lot of information that comes from this belief. And one direct information that we get, of course, the spike of inflation tends to change quite a bit the results. So if you consider the whole sample, we can get something that captures something that maybe we are not. Of course, this is a rare event that didn't occur in the past. So when we do these estimation, things can change quite a bit. We have something similar for PPI. So there is a little bit more stability here. And PPI, that is not too surprising because producer price inflation are mainly driven by international factors. And then what we do next is we develop our analysis a little bit further in terms of first applying this local projection method at different level of measures of inflation. And we also do that by focusing on different approaches, as I said earlier. So we do individual country analysis, first principal component, and also panel regression. So this is the regression model that we use, in which we control for GDP past level of the relevant inflation measure, which is the summation at the end there. And then we also try to control or to make sure that there is no dependence between the shock through the terms WT. So we impose some ordering of the shock, basically saying that the oil supply shocks are the ones that are most exogenous to the others. And this is the general form of the specification that we use, but the details are, of course, a little bit different depending on the approach that we are considering. So at the individual country level, or the principal component, in the case of principal component, Y is the principal component. At the level of the individual country level, Y is the CPI of Switzerland, for example. So there are details that change in the equation, but the spirit is the same. So let me show you first what happens when we look at the CPI version of this. And what we plot there are two lines. Those are the mean of all countries coming from the individual country approach. And we do the mean for the red sample, which is the full sample, and the dashed blue one, which is the one that stops just before the pandemic. And what you see there is a marked difference in terms of how the global supply chain pressure index impact the mean of the variable. Okay, so that's what I was saying earlier on. There's probably something that we're not capturing correctly, I would say, in terms of how these GSCPI enter, because we see that becomes very relevant and also very persistent when we look at the whole sample. And the other aspect that is interesting is that the GSCPI is picking up slowly in terms of impact or its impact on inflation, while both the oil supply shock that we constructed, the demand shock that we construct, a bigger effect on impact. Now, when we look at PPI, we see something similar in terms of pattern, but the size of the effects are bigger. So at the level of CPI, we see bigger effects, but a similar pattern and similar issues in terms of the role of the GSCPI. So again, there is similarity there, and this becomes even more relevant when we look at a core measure of inflation, where we see, again, this incredibly persistent behavior of the shock of the global supply chain pressure index. But the size of the response is very muted relatively to the other two. Now, we do, this is the US case, just for curiosity, in case we're interested, but I'm gonna move a little bit faster. I thought I had less than what the time is telling me. But
you can take a bit more, because we put it 30, but you had 35. So
then we do the same at the level of the principal component. So first, individual country, that's what I show you. I just discussed very briefly the mean one. Then we do the principal component. We extract the principal component from different inflation measure. And then we look at the same local projection equation modified accordingly to see the impact of the different shock. And again, we see something similar. So, and we're gonna see something also similar, let me anticipate also, when we look at the panel one. So this is in some way reassuring, because across all these different ways of looking at the data, we find a similar pattern, but it's also tell us what, I mean, for me, the big question is what is going on at the level of these big persistence of the GSCPI when we look at the response of these different principal component or individual inflation according to the different methodologies that becomes so persistent when we consider the whole sample. PPI, again, is very similar with bigger shocks, and core, again, is very similar, but as you can see there, this marked response of the GS-CPI is even more pronounced in terms of the way it goes, okay? Now, the panel regression approach has its own benefit because, of course, there we can control for country fix effect, and the results that we see are exactly the same in terms of pattern. It's just that if you look at the impulse response, the error bands becomes smaller, of course, because we use and we leverage the power of this cross-country approach. And what we see there, similar pattern in terms of CPI with, again, this divergence between pre and post-pandemic sample, and the role of global demand shock, which becomes a little bit stronger in this case relative to the other one. So let me go fast because there's nothing that different except that we find similar stuff. So this is, as I said, reassuring because across different methodologies and by looking at these measures of inflation, we find a similar pattern. But again, we have a question in terms of why we have these very persistent and also bigger response going over time by looking at the response of the GS-CPI. So last thing I want to say is about historical decomposition. And again, here what we do is that we use we build on what we have derived from the impulse response to try to see how the different shocks help us in accounting for individual inflation or also for the principal components. So we do that again systematically in order to try to see how the shocks at different points in time are going to account for all this. And this is the first graph related to the principal component. And the interesting aspect here is that, of course, we are focusing just on the pandemic sample. And what you see when you focus on the pandemic sample is that at the level of producer price inflation, for example, we see that the blue bars, which correspond to the global supply chain pressure index, are relevant and important. But when it comes to the other measures, we don't see much accounting of our shocks measures in explaining the behavior of the principal component that you have extracted. So there is something more, of course, which we are not measuring here in terms of global dimension that accounts for the principal component that you have extracted from the inflation series at the different levels, so CPI, core, and PPI. And, I mentioned here that one aspect that is important that goes back to what Philip was saying earlier is maybe there is something else that is happening at the pandemic in terms of price setting or in terms of course, the size of the shock itself that we are not capturing with our approach. When we go to pre-pandemic, on the other hand, what we see when we look at the principal component, this is a PPI, we see that our shocks actually do a pretty good job in accounting for the behavior of the principal component of PPI, and that also happens for the other measures of inflation. Let me show you a couple of countries here when we do our decomposition. The US mimic a bit what I showed you earlier. So that's the normalized measure of inflation for different indicators of US inflation and the different shock. So we see more relevance at the level of PPI. But what is particularly interesting here is Mexico, for which we do provide actually a decent accounting of the behavior of inflation. And there, not surprisingly, for an economy like Mexico, the oil supply fluctuation seems to matter a lot. And the other one that I found is interesting, actually, well, Japan, you can see that there is a lot of idiosyncrasies that we discussed or mentioned earlier. But the other one that I found interesting is actually the UK, because according to the way we decompose the data, we see that for the UK, when you look at CPI, there is a big role coming from the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, which is absent or is less relevant at the level of PPI. So there is something that is specific to the UK economy, according to the way we are identifying shock and posing our model, that makes it successful in terms of CPI for accounting the behavior of CPI using our global shocks more than producer price inflation, which is what we should have expected, or we would have expected ex ante. So let me summarize here. This is a little bit of an overview on try to provide an accounting of this global shock for inflation at the global level. So the contribution of our work is to try to look at the role of global shock and see how this global shock are relevant in terms of explaining the global behavior of inflation. One key result is that when we look at these different measures and different approaches, we find robustness in terms of the behavior. And the other aspect that is relevant, in my opinion, is the fact that the principal component is very pronounced during the global surge on inflation in the post-pandemic. But in general, also, if you look at the behavior of inflation pre-pandemic at the level of all these measures of inflation, we find that global factors seems to be accounting well for the behavior of inflation. Now, there is a lot of course, that we need to do and understand in this paper, and I'm very happy to take suggestions, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the paper raised a lot of questions already, but we collect some other questions from the audience. One is from Gordon.
Thank you. I have only one question. I think we should go a little bit more in depth on all, but you have three kinds of global shocks. Now, for Europe, what is most relevant, according to us, is not, well, those are very important, but certainly there's one which is missing, which is the gas supply shock. And I think this plays a very, very different role than the oil supply shock. It is related to the Ukraine war, it is related to the North Sea pipeline and so on. But I think this is something that if you can think how to incorporate would be a major improvement. Thank you.
Yes, I had the same comment, and I mean, some of the parts that are missing are, of course, also non-idiosyncratic shocks. So in the US, there's a big domestic demand shock that's perhaps driving part of the core inflation, but I think it's extremely fascinating, the whole battery results.
Okay. Well, thanks. You're perfectly right. We are not capturing the most important shock, especially for the euro area. When we were back at the Fed, actually, the difficulty we had, I mean, first of was in how we can extract actually the shock, and we didn't have anything ready back then. But I agree with you, it's especially for understanding what is happening in Europe, that it becomes particularly relevant in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. So that's definitely something that is missing and that can add on in terms of explaining the different components of inflation in the euro area. For yes, we didn't want to focus on here on the local component, but that was an aspect that back also in 2021, when we were thinking about this, one question we had was to what extent fiscal policy in the United States was an important driver or determinant of inflation. And back then again, was just the end of 2021, 2022. So we didn't have a good way to think about the impulse. The fiscal impulse. But here we're just trying to abstract from that in terms of just focusing on the global demand side. So we're not looking at the demand impulse that can come domestically. If we were for the United States, for one of the graph I had before, part of course, the residual can be imputed by that, but we don't know to the extent to which you believe in our way of identifying the shock. We should have one way to think about maybe the deviation from discretionary component or discretionary component of a fiscal policy as a way to measure maybe the domestic impulse and see how that can account for what has happened in the United States in terms of inflation. But yes, here we are just focusing mainly on the global side of the inflationary surge.
Thank you. I think we are more or less on time. We have now a coffee break, and you have time for more questions for Gianluca. I'm expecting you to be here in about 20 minutes. There's two fascinating papers, one on social networks and inflation, another one, a historic trip to inflation as conflict. So enjoy your coffee. Thank you.
Preliminare, però grazie per come